There is a version of this story that is easy to tell. The version where the villain is simply a villain, where the cold is just a weapon, where the ice and the frozen rooms and the cryogenic suit are the whole of what he is. A man shaped like a threat, motivated by nothing more complex than the desire to cause harm. That version exists. You can find it in the early comics, in the versions of the character that predate the depth that would eventually be given to him, in the casual shorthand of someone who knows the name, but not the history. Mr. Freeze, ice puns, cold gun, villainous. But that version is not the truth, or rather, it is the surface of the truth, the frozen surface. And what is underneath the surface is something that the easy version cannot hold. What is underneath is a love story. The kind of love story that does not end well. The kind that does not, in any honest telling, end at all, because it is still ongoing, in the only way it can be ongoing. In a man who has lost the ability to feel warmth, and has chosen to interpret that loss as devotion. Tonight, we are going to talk about Victor Freeze. Not Mr. Freeze, Victor Freeze. The man before the accident, before the ice, before the cryogenic suit became the only thing keeping him alive. We are going to go back to the beginning of him, to the cold that was always there, even before the accident gave it a physical form, to the science that was always the language he spoke most fluently, to the woman he loved, and what that love cost him, and what he did with the cost. And we are going to be honest about all of it, about the grief that is real and the harm that is real, about the villain who is also the victim, about the man who only wanted to save the woman he loved and destroyed everything around him trying, including himself. Victor Freeze was not born cold, but he was born toward it. The childhood accounts of Victor Freeze, which vary across different tellings of the character's origin, across different writers and different eras of Batman comics, share certain consistent elements, certain qualities that appear regardless of which specific version you are reading. Isolation, intensity, a relationship with the natural world that was more comfortable than his relationship with people. In some versions of the origin, Victor's childhood is actively painful. A mother who died young, in some tellings by drowning, her body preserved in ice, which the child Victor found not horrifying, but somehow right. A father who was distant and then absent. A childhood defined by the specific loneliness of someone who experiences the world through a different register than the people around him, and cannot find the translation. He was not cruel as a child. This is important. The cruelty comes later, and it comes from a specific cause. The child Victor Freeze was not a child who hurt things. He was a child who was fascinated by them, particularly by cold, by the way that cold changed things, slowed them, preserved them, made the processes that time normally accelerated, decay, change, the inevitable movement of living things toward their endings, stop. There is something in a child who is drawn to preservation, who finds in the stopping of time not a death, but a kindness, who looks at something frozen and sees not a thing that has been killed, but a thing that has been kept. This quality in Victor Freeze is not pathology, not in the child. In the child, it is simply a way of seeing, one of many ways that children find to make sense of a world that doesn't always make sense to them. It becomes something else later, but in the child, it is just vision. He was also brilliant. This is documented across nearly every version of the character. Victor Freeze's intellectual capability is established early and established clearly. Not just smart, not just academically capable. The kind of intelligence that reorganizes the information it encounters, that doesn't just absorb what it learns, but immediately begins working with it, testing it, pushing at its edges to see where it breaks and what the breaking reveals. He excelled in the sciences, in physics and chemistry and biology, in the hard sciences that deal with what the world is made of and how it behaves under different conditions. He did not excel in the social sciences, in the subjects that dealt with how people work, how relationships function, how the invisible infrastructure of human connection is built and maintained. This is not a character flaw. It is a difference in how his mind was organized, but it is a difference that matters for the story we are telling, because the story we are telling is fundamentally about a relationship, about what it means to love someone, about the specific ways that a person who understands physics better than people can succeed and fail at both. Victor Fries grew up, studied, worked with a dedication that those who knew him as a student described as beautiful and slightly frightening, the dedication of someone who has found the thing that makes the world make sense and is not going to be separated from it. He became a cryogenics researcher. Of course he did. He became one of the foremost cryogenics researchers in Gotham, in the country, working on the science of cold, of suspended animation, of the preservation of biological material, of the possibilities that existed at the edges of temperature that most researchers found purely theoretical. Victor Fries did not find them theoretical. He found them urgent. Because by the time he was doing this work, by the time he had built the career and the reputation and the laboratory, he had met Nora, and the urgency had a name. Her name was Nora. In different versions of the Mr. Fries origin story, the details of how Victor and Nora met, how long they were together, what their relationship was like in the years before the tragedy, these details shift. The comics have been told and retold across decades, and different writers have filled in the edges differently. But Nora herself, her essential character, the quality of what she represented to Victor, this is consistent. She was warmth, not as a metaphor, or not only as a metaphor. She was the person in Victor's life who generated the thing that he had difficulty generating himself, the ease of connection, the ability to move through the world with a lightness that his intensity made difficult for him. Victor Fries, who understood the physics of cold better than almost anyone alive, had spent his life at a particular emotional temperature. Not cruel, not empty, but cool. The word is unavoidable, in a way that kept most people at a certain distance. Nora did not keep that distance, not because she didn't notice the quality that others found difficult, but because she looked at it differently. Where others saw remove, she saw focus. Where others felt shut out, she felt curiosity, a genuine desire to understand the person behind the intensity rather than simply responding to the surface of it. She was, by all the accounts that the various tellings provide, genuinely good. Not good in the simple sense, not good as an absence of complexity, but good in the way that the best people are good, consciously, actively, with full awareness of the cost that goodness sometimes requires. She loved Victor, not despite the coldness that others found off-putting, because of it, because she understood it as the shape that his particular form of attention took, his precision, his commitment, the way he brought to their relationship the same total focus he brought to his science. Victor Fries, who had spent his whole life more comfortable with physics than with people, found in Nora someone who made the two things feel like the same thing, who made being a person feel as comprehensible as being a scientist. This is what he was trying to save when everything fell apart. Not just her life. This. The specific quality of the world that existed when she was in it. She got sick. The illness varies in its specifics across different tellings. McGregor's syndrome in the most famous version, the version that the Batman the Animated Series origin story established and that most subsequent versions have built on. A terminal illness. Progressive. Without a known cure. Nora got sick, and the doctors told Victor what the illness meant. And Victor Fries, the scientist, The man who had spent his career studying the possibilities of cold, of suspended animation, of what happens to biological processes when you slow them to their most fundamental levels, made a decision. He would put her in cryogenic suspension. He would preserve her, hold her at the edge of time, in the cold that he understood better than anyone, in the state that the child Victor had found not horrifying, but kind. He would keep her until he could find the cure. He would give her the gift that cold had always offered him. The pause, the preservation, the stopping of the inevitable movement toward the ending. He would save her. He had not asked permission to do this. He had not asked the company he worked for, not gone through the proper channels, not filed the paperwork that would have required review and approval and the slow, deliberate process of institutional science. He had simply done it because there was no time, because the disease was moving faster than the process, because the only thing that mattered was her, and the process was in the way. This decision, this unilateral, unauthorized, driven entirely by love decision, is the hinge of the whole story. Everything that comes after pivots on it. Everything that Victor Fries loses and everything he becomes traces back to this moment. The moment when love, expressed as urgency, bypassed every system of oversight and set everything in motion. His employer found out. GothCorp. In the most common version of the origin, the version that has become most canonical across different media iterations of the character, Victor worked for GothCorp, a Gotham corporation with research divisions that included cryogenics. His employer, Ferris Boyle, the head of GothCorp, discovered what Victor had done, had found the unauthorized use of company equipment and resources for a personal project, had found Nora in the cryogenic chamber, and had decided that this was unacceptable. The specific motives attributed to Ferris Boyle vary. In some versions, it is purely financial. Nora's cryogenic suspension was costly, and the resources were the company's, and Boyle wanted them back. In some versions, there is a crueler dimension, a desire to eliminate the unauthorized project specifically because its discovery represented a liability, and eliminating it meant eliminating the evidence. In the most famous version, the animated series origin, written by Paul Dini in one of the most celebrated single episodes of that series, Boyle is presented as someone who had, beneath a public philanthropist persona, a genuine indifference to anyone else's suffering if their suffering was inconvenient for him. He ordered the experiment shut down. Victor refused. There was a confrontation. In the fight that followed, in the chaos of the moment, in the specific physics of a laboratory environment full of specialized equipment and volatile materials, Victor Fries was knocked into his own experimental chemicals. The cryogenic solution. The same solution that was keeping Nora alive. The accident was catastrophic. The chemicals changed Victor's biology at a fundamental level. His body temperature dropped to sub-zero and stayed there. His physiology reorganized around the cold, not killed by it, because the specific concentration of chemicals and the specific conditions of the accident produced something that should have been impossible. Victor Fries survived. But he survived as something that required cold to continue surviving. Normal temperatures, room temperature, the temperature of a living human being, the temperature of the world outside a cryogenic environment, were now fatal to him. He built a suit. Of course, he built a suit. Victor Fries was a scientist first and always. The suit was the engineering solution to the engineering problem that his new physiology presented. A refrigerated exoskeleton that maintained his body at the temperature it now required.
that allowed him to move through the world that had become, literally, hostile to his continued existence. The suit also gave him capabilities that he had not designed into it as offensive features, but that became offensive features by the nature of what it was. The temperature differential between his environment and the outside world, the cold that his suit generated, could be weaponized. He weaponized it, because Ferris Boyle was still alive, and Nora was still in the cryogenic chamber, and the chamber was now under GothCorp's control. And the man responsible for everything that had happened to Victor and Nora was moving through the world as though nothing had happened, as though a woman wasn't frozen, as though a man hadn't been turned into something that could no longer feel warmth, as though the accident that GothCorp's actions had caused had not permanently altered the lives of two people who had only wanted more time. Victor Freeze became Mr. Freeze, not in a moment of theatrical self-naming, not in a declaration of intent. He became Mr. Freeze the way you become anything when everything else has been taken from you. Gradually, then completely, then with a kind of finality that stops feeling like a loss and starts feeling like the only thing that was ever true. The cold that had been a quality of his personality since childhood was now the condition of his existence. The preservation that he had always found beautiful was now the only way his wife could stay alive. The science that had been his language was now his only means of surviving a world that his body could no longer tolerate. Everything had aligned into something terrible. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from losing someone who is still alive. Not the grief of death, which is its own enormous thing, which has its own weight and its own timeline and its own specific quality of finality. The grief of suspension, of a person who is here, technically, who is preserved, who is not gone, and who is also not present, not conscious, not able to speak or hear or know that you are there beside them, doing everything you know how to do to bring them back. Victor Freeze lives in this grief, has lived in it since the night of the accident. Nora is there. He knows where she is. He can access her. He can see the readouts that tell him her condition is stable, that the suspension is holding. She is not dead. He is not a widower. But he cannot hear her voice, cannot touch her, literally cannot touch her now, cannot experience the warmth of another person's skin because the temperature differential would be lethal, for her or for him or both. Cannot have a conversation, cannot share a meal, cannot sit in a room together and experience the ordinary texture of a life shared between two people. He has lost all of the substance of the relationship. He has only the form of it, the fact of her continued biological existence, the container of her, the possibility that she could come back. That possibility is what he protects. That possibility is what he has organized his entire existence around. And this is where the grief does something specific to a scientist. Because a scientist confronted with grief does not only grieve. A scientist also works. The grief and the work become indistinguishable. The motivation for the science is the grief, and the science is the expression of the grief. And the hours in the lab, and the research, and the endless testing and refinement of approaches, all of it is grief, performed in the language that Victor Freeze has always used most fluently. The problem is that this kind of grief as science cannot be completed, because the completion of the science, the development of a cure for McGregor's syndrome, the thing that would allow Nora to be brought out of suspension and back into the world, that completion would not end the grief. It would end one dimension of the grief, the dimension that says she might not come back. But it would not touch the other dimension, the one that says Even if she comes back, I cannot hold her. Even if the cure works, I am still this. A man in a refrigerated suit, living at temperatures that would kill her, unable to experience the physical warmth of another person. Even if Nora wakes up, Victor Fries cannot be with her the way he was before. He knows this. On some level, he has always known this. The suit that keeps him alive ensures that the life it keeps alive is a life in isolation. And the crimes he commits in the name of saving her, the theft and the violence and the collateral damage of Mr. Freeze's operations in Gotham, those crimes do not save her. They fund the research. They acquire the materials. They create the conditions where the science can continue. But they also ensure that he cannot return to anything like the life he had, even if the science succeeds, even if Nora wakes up. Victor Fries has become Mr. Freeze, and Mr. Freeze cannot go back. Mr. Freeze experiences Gotham differently than any other figure in this city's dark mythology. He sees it through a literal lens, the visor of the suit, which filters the world through the environmental systems that keep him alive. The city that others experience as dark and wet and heavy with its own history is, for Victor Fries, something colder and cleaner, and in certain lights, almost beautiful. Ice does that. It simplifies things, clarifies the edges, makes the world look like what it would be if the messiness of warmth and biological process were removed. Victor walks through Gotham. Mr. Freeze moves through Gotham, seeing a version of the city that no one else sees, the frost that follows him, the ice that forms on surfaces where he stands too long, the stillness that his presence creates. Not just the physical stillness, though the cold that he generates does slow things down, does quiet the ambient motion of a space. The stillness that comes when people see him and stop, when the warmth leaves the room. There is a loneliness to this that Victor Fries has made his peace with, or appears to have made his peace with. The question of whether Mr. Fries has actually accepted his isolation, or whether the acceptance is itself a kind of suspension, a cryogenic preservation of the grief rather than a resolution of it, is one the comics return to repeatedly. Because he behaves, in many situations, like someone who has accepted it, who has organized his existence efficiently around the parameters of his condition, who does not, in most of his interactions with the world, show the grief that is the entire cause of everything he does. And then something reminds him of Nora, a sound, a color, some specific quality of light on water that she would have noticed and named, and the acceptance falls away. And what is underneath it is not acceptance at all. It is the grief, exactly as it was on the night of the accident, preserved, unchanged by time, as though grief, too, can be placed in cryogenic suspension, as though the cold that he lives in has preserved not just Nora, but his feeling for her, exactly as it was, held at the temperature of the night everything changed, waiting for a thaw that the science of his condition says cannot come. Batman's relationship with Victor Fries is one of the most complex in the entire Rogues Gallery. Not complex in the way that the Batman-Joker relationship is complex. That complexity is a collision of opposites, a philosophical war, a relationship defined by what each represents to the other. The Batman-Freeze relationship is complex in a quieter way, in the way that two people can be on opposite sides of a conflict and each fully understand how the other got there. Batman has studied Victor Fries thoroughly, as he has studied every major threat in Gotham. The file, the history, the psychological profile, the motivations and methods and patterns. But the Victor Fries file is different from most files in the Batcave, because most files contain a story of corruption, of someone who chose darkness, who let something rot in them, who turned away from what they could have been and toward what they became. The Victor Fries file contains a love story. A man who loved his wife, who broke the rules to save her, who suffered a catastrophic accident as a result of that breaking, who became something his original self could not have imagined, driven entirely by the continuing need to save the person he had always been trying to save. Batman cannot entirely condemn this. He can condemn the methods, and he does, clearly and without ambiguity. The people hurt by Victor Fries's crimes are real. The harm is real. The violence of Mr. Freeze's operations in Gotham causes suffering that cannot be excused by the motivation behind it. Batman stops Freeze. Every time. Consistently. Without hesitation. But stopping him is not the same as not understanding him. And Bruce Wayne, who lost his parents and converted that loss into the entire project of his adult existence, who has organized everything he is around the grief of a specific night in a specific alley, who understands from the inside what it means to have your whole life restructured by loss. Bruce Wayne understands Victor Fries in a way that is almost uncomfortable. Not as an excuse, never as an excuse, but as a recognition of what loss does to people, of what grief looks like when it is handled by someone who has no tools for it except the tools they were already carrying when the loss arrived. Victor Fries's tool was science. Bruce Wayne's tool was training and money and obsession and the willingness to push his body into states that it was not designed to sustain. Different tools, same driver. In the best versions of their encounters in the comics, in the moments where the writers allow the relationship its full complexity, there is something between them that is not animosity. It is recognition. Two men who organized their lives around a loss, who became something unrecognizable from what they might have been, who are, in their respective ways, still trying. One of them is trying to protect the city. One of them is trying to save a woman in a frozen chamber. Both of them are, in the deepest sense, still in the moment of the loss, still responding to it, still refusing to let it be final. The difference is what the refusal costs. We have been telling this story from Victor's perspective, and that is natural. He is the one who survived in a form that can act and speak and move through the world. He is the one with agency in this story. But Nora has a perspective too, a perspective that for most of the story's history she cannot express, because she is frozen. Because the suspension that Victor placed her in, the act of love that became the pivot point for everything, removed her from the narrative. She is preserved in it. She is the cause of it. She is the person that every single thing Victor does is directed toward. And she has no voice in any of it. This is not a small thing. In later versions of the Mr. Freeze story, in the comics that have been written since the character's reinvention in the 1990s, some writers have grappled with this, have tried to give Nora her own interiority, have tried to ask the question that the story's original telling didn't ask. What would Nora want? Would she want this? Would she want the woman she was? Kind, warm, someone who moved through the world with ease and connection, to be the cause of decades of violence? Would she want Victor to become Mr. Freeze? Would she want to be the reason that other people suffered? That the researchers Victor stole from lost their work? That the facilities he destroyed lost their function? That the people caught in the cold of his operations were hurt? The honest answer, based on everything we know about who Nora was before the accident, is almost certainly no. Nora would not want this. The woman who loved Victor,
who saw past the cool intensity that others found off-putting, who valued connection and warmth and the ordinary texture of a shared life. That woman would not choose this. She would not choose to be preserved at the cost of everything that Victor is doing to preserve her. She would probably choose to let the disease run its course, to have whatever time remained, to end the way living things end, rather than be held in suspension while the man she loved became something that could no longer hold her. This is the tragedy underneath the tragedy. Victor Fries has not saved Nora. He has saved the biological fact of Nora, at the cost of everything that made Nora herself, including her ability to choose. He has loved her so completely that he has removed her agency entirely, has made the decision that he cannot lose her, and in making that decision unilaterally, has ensured that she cannot decide anything. This is not a condemnation of Victor Fries. It is a recognition of what grief does when it is powerful enough, and the person feeling it is capable enough to act on it without restraint. Grief that is powerful enough and unopposed enough does not liberate the person it is about. It freezes them. Victor Fries, who spent his career studying preservation, has preserved his wife in every sense. Her body, her condition, her position in time, and his relationship to her, his grief, his love, all of it frozen at the moment of the accident, all of it kept exactly as it was, because he cannot bear to let it move forward. Because moving forward means accepting that things change. And accepting that things change means accepting that she might not come back. And that is the one thing Victor Fries cannot accept. There is a concept in cryogenics, in the actual science that Victor Fries built his career on, called controlled thaw. It refers to the process of bringing something out of cryogenic suspension, the careful, precise, monitored process of allowing temperature to rise in a way that preserves the integrity of what was preserved. Too fast, and the biological material is damaged by the ice crystals that form during rapid temperature change. Too slow, and other processes that the suspension was suppressing begin to reassert themselves in ways that can be destabilizing. Controlled thaw requires patience, precision, a willingness to allow the process to happen at its own rate rather than the rate that urgency demands. It requires the scientist to trust the process rather than forcing the outcome. This is the science of letting go. Not abandonment, not giving up, not accepting defeat, but releasing control of the rate of change, trusting that the thing you are trying to preserve can survive the process of returning to the world, allowing the temperature to rise, slowly and carefully, knowing that some change will occur and accepting that change as the cost of return. Victor Fries is the world's foremost expert in this process, and he cannot apply it to himself, cannot perform the controlled thaw of his own grief, cannot allow the temperature of his own emotional state to rise, carefully and precisely, towards something that might resemble acceptance or change or the ongoing movement of life after loss. He is frozen in the moment of the accident, and the extraordinary irony, the kind that only this specific story contains, only this specific character whose outer condition is a perfect mirror of his inner one, is that the man who knows exactly how to bring something back from suspension cannot bring himself back. He knows the science. He cannot perform it on himself, because the controlled thaw requires the scientist to be outside the thing being thawed, and Victor Fries is inside his grief, has been inside it since the night of the accident, is, in the most complete sense, suspended in it. Batman cannot thaw him either. This is the limitation that the Batman-Fries relationship always runs into, in every version of the story where the writers push far enough to find it. Batman can stop Freeze, can prevent the harm, can return him to Arkham or to whatever facility is responsible for his containment in any given moment. But he cannot reach the grief, cannot perform the operation that would require being inside it with Victor, at the temperature where everything is held, in the place where the accident is always just happening. No one can reach it, because the one person who might have been able to reach it, the one person with the warmth and the specific quality of connection that Victor responded to, is in the chamber, suspended, waiting for a thaw that Victor is simultaneously working toward and psychologically unable to allow. Because bringing Nora back means the grief ends, and the grief ending means Victor has to become someone who exists after the loss, rather than inside it. And becoming that person means letting go of the version of himself that has been preserved alongside her. And Victor Freeze does not know who he is without the cold, without the mission, without the suspension, without the specific purpose that the accident gave him by taking everything else away. He knows cryogenics. He knows physics. He knows the science of cold and the engineering of the suit and the chemistry of the treatment he is trying to develop. He does not know how to be the person who comes after all of this. So he stays in it, frozen, working, preserved. Victor Freeze has been to Arkham Asylum, not as a patient in the traditional sense, not in the way that most of Gotham's rogues occupy Arkham, in the standard cells, in the standard wards. His condition requires a modified environment, a frozen room, a space that has been engineered to maintain the temperatures his body requires, a cell that is, in its thermal properties, a scaled-down version of the suit that
allows him to survive in the world outside. Arkham has built this space for him, because it has to. Because the alternative, housing Victor Freeze in standard conditions, would kill him. And Arkham Asylum, for all its dysfunction and its failures and its extraordinary history of producing exactly the outcomes it was designed to prevent, does not want to kill its inmates. The frozen room is one of the strangest spaces in Arkham. The staff who have to interact with it, who have to deliver what passes for meals in an appropriate form, who have to conduct the monitoring that institutional care requires, describe it consistently in their notes as unlike any other space in the building. The silence is different. Cold rooms are quieter than warm rooms because cold slows the molecular activity that generates ambient noise. The ordinary sounds of a building, the creaking of settling structures, the movement of air through ventilation systems, the thousand small sounds that bodies in motion produce, all of these are muted in the frozen room. It is the quietest space in an institution that is not known for its calm. And Victor Freeze, in the frozen room, is often simply sitting. This is noted across many accounts, by staff, by the occasional psychologist who attempts a session with him through the monitoring systems, by Batman in the rare instances where he has visited the room. He sits. He thinks. He is, by external observation, almost entirely still. The stillness of a man in suspension, not the peace of someone at rest, the held quality of someone waiting, of someone whose whole existence has been organized around a moment that has not arrived yet, who has learned to occupy the time between now and that moment with a minimal expenditure of everything. Waiting is more efficient when you hold still. In the frozen room, Victor Freeze sometimes talks about Nora. Not to anyone specifically. The monitoring systems recorded. The staff review the recordings in the same spirit that Arkham reviews all recordings, looking for information that might be clinically relevant. What they find is not clinically useful in any conventional sense. He talks to her, as though she can hear him, as though the distance between the frozen room and wherever Nora is being held doesn't exist, as though cold, which he understands as a medium for preservation, is also a medium for transmission. He tells her about the research, about the latest approach, the latest refinement, the latest development in the science of McGregor's syndrome that might bring him closer to the cure. He tells her about Gotham, the city she knew when they were in it together, when Victor was a researcher and she was alive in the full sense. The city that has changed since then, that is always changing, always adding new strata to its long, dark history. He tells her he is close. He always tells her he is close. Whether this is true in any given moment is a question the science can answer. Whether Victor Fries believes it, regardless of what the science says, that is not a question. He always believes it. He has to. The Mr. Freeze who exists in the comics is not a single consistent character. He has been written and rewritten across decades. Different eras, different creative teams, different versions of the Gotham mythology have produced different versions of Victor Fries. Some simpler, some more complex, some closer to the tragedy the character contains, and some that flatten that tragedy into something more conventionally villainous. The earliest Mr. Freeze, the character who first appeared in 1959, created by Dave Wood and Sheldon Moldoff, was called Mr. Zero. He was, in the vocabulary of that era, a relatively simple, cold-themed criminal. The ice puns, the cold gun, the motivation that was not yet fully developed into what it would become. He was not Victor Fries yet. He was a type. The character was given his current name in the 1960s Batman television series, which leaned into the theatricality rather than the tragedy. Mr. Freeze, as played in that era, was a villain in the mode of the show, elaborate, campy, defined by his gimmick. Still not the character we have been talking about tonight. That character, Victor Fries, the grieving husband, the man who only wanted to save the woman he loved, emerged fully from Paul Dini and Bruce Timm's reinvention of the character for Batman, the animated series, in 1992. The episode is called Heart of Ice. It won an Emmy Award for a children's animated show, which tells you something about how far the reinvention went. In 22 minutes of animation, Paul Dini gave Mr. Freeze a depth that the character had never had, and that many of Batman's rogues, who have been around far longer and appeared in many more stories, have never achieved. He gave him the love story. He gave him the accident. He gave him the grief that is the only honest explanation for everything else. And the comics, responding to the success of this reinvention, retroactively applied the new origin to the print version of the character. Victor Fries in the comics became the Victor Fries of the animated series, which is an unusual reversal of the normal direction of influence, but one that the character entirely justified. Because the Dini version was simply more true to what the character, if you looked at him closely enough and honestly enough, had always been capable of being. More true to the tragedy that was always latent in the concept of a man who lived in cold, who could not be touched by warmth, who spent his existence trying to restore a life that the accident had made impossible to restore. The animated series version has been refined and extended and complicated in the decades since Heart of Ice. Some later versions have gone darker, have revealed complexities in Victor's psychology that the Dini origin didn't explore, have asked harder questions about whether the love that drives him is as pure as it appears, or whether it contains dimensions of control and obsession that the grief narrative obscures. These are legitimate questions. The love that expresses itself as unilateral preservation, as deciding for someone else that they will be kept, that they will not be allowed to end, that their autonomy over their own ending will be superseded by someone else's inability to let go. That love has a shadow. It is still love. Victor Fries is not performing love as a cover for something else. The grief is real. The devotion is real. But love Even real love can do harm, can freeze the thing it is trying to warm, can hold so tightly that what is held cannot breathe. The best versions of Mr. Freeze hold all of this, the real love and the harm it causes, the genuine tragedy and the genuine culpability, the grief that is understandable and the violence that is inexcusable. All of it true at once, all of it part of the same man. That is what makes him one of Batman's most important adversaries. Not the ice gun, not the cryogenic suit, the truth of him. Gotham City has a complicated relationship with winter. The city's darkness, which we have spoken about across this series, which runs all the way down to the bedrock and the founding families and the night in the forest. That darkness is perhaps most legible in winter. In summer, Gotham can almost pass for a normal city. The heat and the light and the particular energy of warm months softens the edges, fills the streets, puts people in proximity in ways that generate something resembling community. In winter, Gotham is what it is. The streets empty earlier. The cold that comes off the bay is different from the cold of inland cities, damper, heavier, the kind of cold that doesn't just lower the temperature, but seems to lower the ambient spirit of whatever it touches. Buildings that look merely Gothic in summer look menacing in winter. Shadows that are dramatic in summer are absolute in winter. Gotham in winter is a city that has stopped pretending, that has dropped the performance of livability and revealed the architecture of control and precarity underneath. The people who live in the Narrows, in the East End, in the neighborhoods that the city's official culture prefers not to think about, they feel winter differently in Gotham than they would feel it anywhere else. The cold in those neighborhoods is not managed the way it is managed in the upper districts. The heating infrastructure is older, less reliable. The distances from warmth are greater in every sense. Mr. Freeze moves through Gotham in a condition that is Gotham's winter externalized. He is the cold that the city generates, the cold that comes with inequality, with the gap between the heated towers and the unheated apartments, with the specific temperature of a city that was arranged to keep certain people in conditions of controlled scarcity. He is not responsible for that cold. He did not design the inequality, but he embodies it. And Batman, who moves through the same city and has always understood that the cold, the figurative cold of Gotham's darkness, its structures of power and suffering, is not natural but arranged. Batman sees this about Freeze, sees the man who is the cold the city produces, who carries it literally, who cannot separate himself from it, who is, in some essential way, the walking truth of what Gotham does to people. This may be why Batman cannot simply hate him. You cannot hate the truth. You can work against it. You can refuse to accept it as inevitable. You can do everything in your power to change the conditions that produce it. But you cannot hate the person who is, simply in their own particular and devastating way, the truth made visible. Victor Freeze did not choose to be the cold. He chose to save his wife. Everything else happened to him, as it always does in Gotham. You make one choice for the right reasons, and the city does the rest. Victor Freeze has not given up. This is important, and it is easy to miss in the narrative of Mr. Freeze as a villain. The ice, the cold gun, the operations in Gotham that constitute his criminal career, these things read as darkness, as the behavior of someone who has descended into something that has no upward direction. But underneath all of it, underneath the suit and the crimes and the frozen room in Arkham and the decades of failed attempts to develop a cure, underneath everything is something that has not been extinguished. Hope. Victor Freeze believes
genuinely and without irony, that he will find the cure, that McGregor's syndrome will yield to the science, as everything ultimately yields to the science, that the approach he has not yet tried will be the approach that works, that Nora will come out of suspension and be well, and be alive, and be the person she was before the illness. He believes this, not as a delusion, not in the way that Arkham's truly delusional patients believe things that have been definitively contradicted by reality, as a scientific hypothesis, one that has not yet been proven, but that he has not yet proven impossible. And here is the thing about Victor Fries that is hardest to carry, and also most important to carry. He might be right. The science of suspended animation and the treatment of diseases that were once considered terminal is not static. It advances. The things that are impossible in one decade become possible in the next. The cures that don't exist yet are being worked toward in labs around the world by researchers who don't know Victor Fries and have no stake in his specific tragedy. McGregor's syndrome might be curable someday. The work might work. The hope is not irrational. It is sustained by real science, real progress, real possibility. What it costs in the sustaining, what harm is done in the pursuit of what might someday be achievable, that is the tragedy. Not that the hope is false, but that the hope is real enough to justify, in Victor's calculus, everything he does to maintain it. This is one of the most uncomfortable things about the Mr. Freeze story, because the comfortable version, the version where the hope is clearly delusional, where the villainous behavior is clearly pointless, where there is no chance that any of this will work, that version lets you feel clear. The uncomfortable version, where the hope might be justified, where the science might eventually succeed, where all the harm done in the service of this mission might, in some terrible future, be vindicated by a cure, that version doesn't let you feel clear. That version just lets you feel sad. For Nora, for the person in the frozen chamber who did not choose any of this, whose continued biological existence is being used to justify a man's inability to accept the possibility of her death. For the people hurt by Mr. Freeze's operations, who are collateral to a love story they were never part of. And for Victor, for the scientist who loved his wife, who broke the rules for her, who was turned into something that could no longer feel warmth, who has been working every day in the cold that is both his condition and his grief, toward a cure that might come too late, or might not come at all, or might come exactly when the science says it will, and still not be enough to thaw what has been frozen the longest. Victor Fries, in the cold, still working, still hoping. There is a dimension of Victor Fries's existence that is rarely discussed in the context of his story. Not the grief, not the science, not the love for Nora or the crimes in her name. The sensory dimension, what it is like to live in a body that cannot feel warmth. Human beings are thermal creatures. We regulate our temperature with extraordinary precision. We seek warmth instinctively, move toward heat sources, wrap ourselves in materials that hold body heat, develop cultural practices around warmth that are among the oldest and most universal in human history. Fire, the gathering around it, the specific comfort of shared warmth, two bodies in proximity, the warmth that passes between them not just physical, but communicative, the language of warmth, a hand on a shoulder, an embrace, the specific weight of another person's presence. Victor Fries experiences none of this. His body temperature is sub-zero. He cannot feel the warmth of a room, cannot feel the warmth of the sun on his face, cannot experience the warmth that passes between two people when they are close.
he cannot feel warmth. And warmth is a primary channel through which human beings experience safety, connection, love. He experiences cold. He knows cold in every register, the specific quality of different temperatures, the way cold behaves in different atmospheres, the thermal signatures of different materials and environments. He knows cold the way a person with full senses knows the full sensory world. But the warmth is gone. Not entirely unfamiliar, he remembers it. He was warm once. He knows what it is conceptually, remembers what it was experientially. But he cannot feel it. Cannot feel Nora's warmth, even when he is as close to her as the suit allows. Cannot feel the warmth of any human being. Cannot feel the warmth of a room in which people he cares for exist. This is a loss that exists separately from the grief for Nora, alongside it, deepening it. Because the grief for Nora is also, at its most physical, a grief for warmth, for the specific quality of life that warmth makes possible and that he can no longer access. He works in the cold. He thinks in the cold. He plans and researches and fights and waits in the cold. All of it is done at temperatures that would kill most living things. And in the rare moments when the science is going well, when a new approach seems promising, when the data from the latest trial suggests movement in a direction that could eventually lead to the cure, in those moments, something happens in Victor Freeze's voice. Something that the monitoring systems at Arkham have picked up, and that the staff who review the recordings have noted, without quite being able to categorize it. A quality. That is the best word anyone has found for it. A quality in his voice that is different from its ordinary register. Not exactly warmth. Not exactly hope. Something in between. Something that the cold has not been able to reach. Something that is still, somehow, there, after everything. After the accident, and the suit, and the decades, and the frozen room, and all the nights in the cave working toward a cure that hasn't come yet. Still there, unmistakably, inarguably, stubbornly, still there. The story of Victor Freeze is not a comfortable story. It does not resolve into a clear moral lesson, does not produce a villain who is simply wrong and a hero who is simply right, does not offer the clean satisfaction of a story where the bad person is bad for simple reasons and stopping them produces unambiguous good. It offers something harder. It offers a person, a complete, specific, fully realized person, whose motivations are understandable and whose methods are harmful, and whose love is real, and whose grief is genuine, and who has become something that causes suffering while trying to prevent it. And it asks us, the audience, the listeners, the people spending time in this story, to hold all of that at once. To feel sympathy for Victor Freeze without excusing Mr. Freeze. To understand the love without minimizing the harm. To see the grief without allowing the grief to become an explanation for everything. This is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be uncomfortable. Because the world is full of people like Victor Freeze. People whose motivations are understandable and whose methods cause harm. People who are doing genuine damage in the name of something that genuinely matters to them. And the story of Victor Freeze is asking us to develop the capacity to see both things at once. To not flatten the person into the crime, and to not flatten the crime into the person. Batman holds this capacity. It is one of the things that makes him who he is. The ability to understand, fully and without flinching, the person on the other side. To see Freeze not only as a threat to be neutralized, but as a person to be understood. This doesn't make his job easier. In some ways, it makes it much harder.
but it makes it more honest. It makes the stopping of Freeze something other than simple victory. It makes it tragedy, understood clearly, and responded to with as much compassion as the situation allows. Which is to say, with enough compassion to see the person and enough clarity to stop the harm. Both things, at once. Always, both things. In some later versions of the Mr. Freeze story, in the comics written in the decades after the character's animated series reinvention, Nora does wake up. In these versions, she is brought out of suspension. The process is not always Victor's doing. Sometimes the circumstances that bring her back are complicated, involve other parties, happen in ways that Victor did not fully control. But she wakes up. And the moment she wakes up, the story that Victor has been living for decades, the story of the man working toward the moment of her return, has to contend with the actual person that she is. Not the Nora he has been preserving in his memory. Not the Nora who exists in the recordings he plays in the frozen room, in the photographs that are the only warm things in his cold environment. Not the Nora who has been suspended at the moment before the illness progressed, perfectly preserved, exactly as she was. The actual Nora, who has woken up into a world that has moved on without her, whose husband has become something she does not fully recognize, who has to find her way into a present that has accumulated decades of history since she last experienced it. And these versions of the story, to their credit, do not resolve this easily, because it is not easy. The gap between the Nora Victor preserved and the Nora who wakes up, not just chronologically, but experientially, is enormous. She is the same person, biologically. She carries the same memories, the same values, the same essential character. But she has lost time, and he has changed in ways that the time made inevitable. And the relationship between them, the relationship that was the cause of everything, that was the whole of Victor's reason for everything he did, that relationship has to be rebuilt between two people who are not the same people they were when it began. In some of these later versions, the relationship does not survive. Nora leaves, not because she does not understand what Victor did, not because she cannot see the love behind the harm, the grief behind the crimes, but because she is a person, with her own agency, her own perspective, her own response to what she has woken up into. And her response, honestly considered, is that she cannot stay, cannot rebuild a life alongside someone who carries everything that Mr. Freeze carries, cannot be the reason, the justification, the answer to the question that Victor's whole existence has been built around. She was never asked if she wanted to be that. She was preserved before she could answer, and when she finally gets to answer, the answer is hard and true. And Victor Freeze, who only wanted to save her, has to learn the thing that grief always eventually requires. That love does not always mean holding on. That saving someone sometimes means letting them go. That the controlled thaw, the careful, precise, patient release of control, is not abandonment. It is the final act of love. The hardest thing he has ever had to learn, from the woman he always wanted to teach him everything. Victor Freeze is still out there, in the frozen room, or in the city, or in the cave where the science continues. In whatever version of this story we find ourselves in tonight, he is still working, still believing with the specific quality of a scientist's faith, evidence-based, hypothesis-driven, refused to be final until the experiment is complete, that the cure will come, that the work will work, that the woman in the frozen chamber will open her eyes into a world where the warmth has returned to both of them. Maybe it will. The story is still being written. The comics have not finished with Victor Freeze.
The character that Paul Dini reinvented in 1992 is still being explored, still being extended, still accumulating new dimensions in the hands of writers who understand that the tragedy at his center has not been exhausted. It may never be exhausted, because the tragedy at his center is not a comic book tragedy. It is a human one. It is the tragedy of loving someone you cannot reach, of wanting to save someone and not having the power, of building your entire existence around a hope that may not be realized, and choosing every day to continue building anyway. It is the tragedy of grief that gets stuck, that freezes at the moment of loss and cannot find its way forward, of a person who understood cold better than anyone alive and still could not understand that some things cannot be preserved by holding them still, that love, like all living things, requires movement, requires change, requires the willingness to let the temperature rise. Victor Fries, in the cold, with the science and the grief and the hope and the harm, is still learning this, or trying to, in the only language he has. Somewhere in Gotham tonight, it is colder than it should be. A room somewhere that is 6 degrees lower than the air outside it. A space that is quieter than the spaces around it, where a man in a refrigerated suit is sitting and thinking and waiting and working. And still, in the way that some things survive even the most absolute cold, loving her, as completely as he did the day she got sick, as completely as he did the day of the accident, as completely as he has every day since, in the cold, in the quiet, in the only way he knows how. The rain falls, soft tonight, the kind of rain that sounds like something trying to reach you, like something patient, like something that has been waiting a long time and is not in any hurry, like love, expressed in the only language the world left available, like cold, which is just warmth with everything taken away, like a man who only wanted to save the woman he loved, still trying, still cold, still here.